Anglish is a conlaying project in an alternate history where the Normans lost the Battle of Hastings and Middle English evolved without excessive influence from French words. Now, like a lot of Old English projects, it can get racist if you dig too far, but it is an interesting way to improve the forcefulness of your vocabulary, though I kind of lost interest because Norman vocabulary is just so interwoven. It breaks up everything and makes you have to pull out random extinct words like wagon or blin. But this video isn't about Anglish. Well, not entirely. It's more about the alternate history scenario. What if there was a conlanging project within the world of Anglish where the Normans won? What if they tried to reconstruct English? Well, for starters, we have to determine what exact version of English we're dealing with. I tend to just lean into the denormanizing of it, where we don't do some Icelandic hyper-purist thing and translate computer as number vulva. We can keep modern loanwords and Norse influence so we can still use egg and skin. That leaves Latin. Now, Latin and Norman words are not the same, and their existence in English isn't really the result of Norman influence, and in fact they often form doublets between French and Latin-derived forms. However, I do think that the existence of the two-layered system in early Middle English definitely allowed for the insertion of a third layer which then spills all its Latin words onto us. Explicitly churchy words like cardinal or sacrament can stay, but we don't need random verbs like extract. So this is the world of Anglish. An example sentence would likely be the same because it would mostly only involve native words, but looking at this one, to be specific, we could say something like, a forbidden deeming would likely be the same because it would only wind in inborn words. Now this does come with a bit of a problem in that it deprives us of a lot of productive suffixes. No more shun, no more mint, no more no more ol, no more unts. The only deverbal is ing, which is also the participle former and zero derivation, so that means we might have to do the unthinkable and bring back und. What other affixes do we lose, and how do we replace them? Well, esk, oid, eel, and et are replaced by ish, e, and like, and eyes, if I, and are replaced by b, in, and just zero derivation. Anyway, we get to keep ness. Now, there's missing space to cover that fortunately doesn't require extra unused verbs. However, this does lead to some weirdness. A lot of verbs are preposition prefixes, like retreat, sustain, expand, secede. Broadly, there are 3 different ways of calculating these in English, all of which have their own benefits. The direct approach would use a prefix and a verb. I guess the main issue would be that we don't really use any of these prefixes anymore, and so it would be largely incomprehensible. Yes, there are cemented forms, like retract becomes withdraw, which is almost an exact calc. However, there's also preposition and verb, which gives us draw back. I would use this approach to look the most like modern English, which is what I want. However, it might just not be accurate. And then there's a German version with a separable prefix, which is basically the same as the last one, except it separates into the transitive I backdraw and transitive I draw something back. But back to Ccythicc. Sorry, that's what I'm calling it. Since I know what English looks like with Norman influence, I'm adding a bit more to the scenario to make it unpredictable. Basically, English and Ccythicc are coexisting. Ccythicc is spoken by English people deported to Australia because Rome still controls Europe. Don't worry about it. So, Australia is settled by English, French, and of course influence from the existing Australian languages. These develop together into the Anglic language called Ccythicc. So, we start with Old English and phonology. Old English has, in theory, 18 consonants. At least it uses 18 letters to write everything. That's not counting soft and hard g and intervocalic voicing and devoicing after h, but we can circle back to that. In terms of vowels, Old English has 10 short and 10 long vowels plus 4 extra umlaut vowels. Yes, I'm counting diphthongs as unique vowels because I'm anti-Semitic. Old French, on the other hand, has 21 consonants and like 12-ish vowels with no length distinction. Also, 4 of them are nasal vowels, which is like... and also a bajillion diphthongs that don't need to be their own vowels. And, of course, the Aboriginal Australian languages, what do they add? In Western Australia, at least, the voiceless palatal plosive seems to be a surprisingly common through line, and so an entire palatal set of consonants. So, what are the sound changes and reflexes that merge these 3 series into the modern Ccythicc? Well, Labial consonants largely remain the same. The English system of intervocalic voicing for f, s, th has to devolve like it did in English. Similarly, k, g, and h are all reasonable, with some weirdness around ch versus h and r versus g, but they merged in English. Now, in Dutch, the r devoiced and merged with ch, but this isn't Dutch, and for that matter, n, l, t, d, s, z, th, th, and w can all stay the same. The palatal and velar nasals can merge, and since the palatal set is the one I'm focused on, it stays palatal. The real trouble is everywhere else. The Old English ch, sh, and irregular j, as well as the Norman ch, j, ts, and z, need to be taken care of by amalgamating into a palatal mess. Arbitrarily, as is unfortunately quite often the best way of doing this, I merged ts, sh, and the Old English ch into the fricative sh, z into ja, and the Norman ch into kh, as well as Old English khs, which is ks, and k before a front vowel to justify the spelling. Both languages' j's can merge into some voiced palatal sound like ja or ja or even just ja. So where does ta come from? Palatalization. Now, palatalization is tricky because the English already lost y whenever it occurs after a consonant. However, we do have y at this time, which could break apart into u like it did in English. At least the Norman version. The Old English version just unrounded. Now, this phoneme y arises from both Old English and Norman, either from the umlauted version of oo or just oo rotating over to y and dragging up o to meet it. Now, this is still an ongoing process in Old French, and could even be a part of early Ccythicc, which is how we ended up with the name. The English equivalent would be Southish, the language of the South. Old English, Sulish. Like I explained, Old English, sh becomes sha. This long oo migrates to the front and then breaks up, leaving sya, which also becomes sha, so we get Sulish. So palatalization rules would be tia, kya becomes kya, sya becomes sha, and zya becomes zya, and nya becomes nya. Now, over to vowels. Like I said, some of English oo becomes u, though this is irregular. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, and the original English u becomes closing diphthongs. The French monophthongal vowels can be sorted more easily as the long forms of English vowels, with oo as oo, o as o, e as e, a as a as a, and e as e. And e I already talked about. These mostly line up with the long equivalents of the Old English vowels, with the exception that a and oo are actually short. In English, long a raises up into o, a process that's accelerated by it being paired with the French o. I should mention e, and o have a length distinction that breaks down into vowel quality, like it does in both previously in French and later in English. So that leaves the diphthongs a, o, and u. A merges with a like it does in English. Short o becomes and eventually the schwa. Short u becomes u. Long u becomes u. And of long o, well, that gets into the one more phonological thing. What do we do with the R? In both of these languages, it's currently the trilled or tapped ra or ra, but we know in both modern languages it's weird, so as usual in Ccythicc, we end up with some weird palatal combination. Ra. Now, with how liquid it is, this letter bleeds into a lot of other diphthongs, whether present there initially or not, so long o becomes o. It's set in Australia, after all. You have to expect some of these sounds. So what do I mean by other diphthongs? Well, for the most part, these were formed by irregular reflexes of r, such as in rain and berry. Do I want Reagan? No, but these newly formed diphthongs will often substitute the final part for that bunched r, yielding rarn. Now, because of this quirk of R, we get something similar to non-roticity, which means R is largely a silent letter and is only pronounced if doubled. This leads to a weird and confusing spelling system. So, the English of this setting still uses runes, so Ccythicc is primarily spelt with runes and secondarily spelt with Latin. This essentially leads to some English spelling rules being copied over wholesale despite having none of the logic. In English, f and v aren't fully allophonic, but they are represented by the same letter, with v being the intervocalic version. For example, sniffle and snivel are basically spelt the same, but sniffle is doubled, so it isn't intervocalic. In Ccythicc, They don't have any kind of complementary distribution, so f is always doubled and v is always single. This applies to all fricatives, as we see in the name. Yeah, so a lot of doubled consonants. Fricatives are doubled to be voiceless, r is doubled just to be audible in the first place, and of course vowels are doubled to be long. Yes, there are a lot of vowels. It's a Germanic-wide problem. Vowels can also be lengthened by being put in an open syllable, which doesn't make any sense because Ccythicc doesn't have lengthening like that. It's just a convention copied over from English. And also, h is doubled to be ch. Ch emerges from qua from English or Norman, or hua when before a back vowel. So we do get a contrast between whole and whole, except that's a terrible example because whole used to just be h, who and ho. What else can we double? Well, if we aren't doing tapped R, we could do tapped T. That's right, bread and butter. So D has to be doubled to be duh, and single D is wrapped. This emerges from D, T, and nt in a variety of conditions. So, numbers 1 through 10, that's a good place to start. In Old English, these are an, toi, thro, fower. I'm not using win because it sucks. Fif, siux, seofon, eachta, nyon, tune. 2 is irregular, and the masculine form twegen is how we get twain. So, raises up to o, and we get to this on. Is this better as doubled or open syllable? I'll try to lean towards doubled in Saxon words and open in Norman words. Toi becomes two or just to, or masculine twin. Throw becomes throw. The double R is a bit much, so we'll drop the first one, and I guess now it matches with third. Fower becomes four. Fief is fief. Siux is siuk. That's how k is spelled with a k before a front vowel. Seufon is seven. Achta is ar. Niun is niun, and tune is tune. Now, after a palatalized consonant, do you spell it as u or u? Well, it's inconsistent and creates homophones. This letter X is for t, by the way. This is actually the perfect segue into the alphabet, because if they're all runes, they need names. So this is based off of the Old English Phonology, but we will draw on both Norman and Saxon words, so we start with fechu, cattle or wealth, Old English feuch. Now, in English, this becomes fee because of Latin. In English, we would expect fe, and in Ccythicc, it would become for, a homophone of for but without the silent R. From Norman, a word with a similar definition would be value, which is Ccythicc falu. Now, value is kind of weird because it's a feminine participle and really means she who had value, which is not the most predictable semantic drift. Something like he who has value, valiant, would make sense if we're even doing a verbal derivative. Valor is the noun equivalent, which lost out for some reason. Anyway, I is short a, V is single, F double L to make it short. The back vowel and the R merge into or, represented by a short U and a silent R to make it stay short. This rune is valor. I'm gonna run out of time, aren't I? Whatever. Next is ur, which means aurochs, an extinct ancestor of cattle. Since it's extinct and they don't even have cattle in Australia, I'm switching it out for another spiky animal, the urchin. This is Norman Edichun. That's not a U. Oh, dear. And ur is long, so it shifts over to U. Okay. Urchins are small and stupid anyways. Orca is way better. The French version of this is just orc. R messes up the vowel and it becomes orc. In theory, we don't have to do the English thing where we stretch every word out to 3 letters, but I like doubling letters, so we get orc. Thorn is probably good as is, but it again has or, and so it becomes thorn, and that would just be the third rune in a row with a short U. We could instead take it all the way back to the rune's original meaning of monster, which would be theus. Norman can't supply anything it doesn't have the. My main issue with theus for monster is that it kind of overlaps with orca semantically, so we could return to our Germanic roots with the god Thor himself, and instead name the rune thunder. So, ironically, that short U would be a long U for Thuner, probably flapped into Thur. And that is where we have to end the video today. Hype this video if you're on mobile. I don't care if you like it or anything, but you have to hype it. Alright, bye.